I would like to now welcome up to the stage Liss Gabb from Vic Health. This is a really fabulous opportunity for me. Liss was at our 2017 Leadership Summit. That's where I first met Liss. But before that, I had heard you present at the 2014 International Arts and Health Conference um, in Melbourne. I was freshly back from maternity leave with an extremely young baby, thinking I might walk into this arts and health space. And Liss's talk then was actually what sealed the deal for me. So you've got big shoes to fill of your own, that you're of your own making, Liss. Can I let you introduce yourself since I don't have my presenter notes visible here? Thank you so much, Liss.
Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, and I feel very honoured to have been asked to share a little bit about my leadership journey. But I'd like to start first by paying my respects to the people of the Gadigal, start that again, Liz. I'd like to pay my respects to elders of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the room or online with us today. My name is Liss, Liss Gabb. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a woman of English and Dutch settler heritage. I'm just going to see if she's got my slide. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Oh, great, Claire. Thank you. So again, thank you very much, Claire, for the opportunity. I too had to think a lot when I got the invitation from Claire about what I mean by leadership and journey. They're two words that I had to give some thought to. And I guess for me, I don't really often speak about myself as a leader. That's just not the way I think about myself, even though I've held a lot of positions of responsibility, and particularly in kind of positions pushing the boundaries of arts and health practice. But I guess it's about, for me, leadership is about leading from within. It is about always leading in relationship with. Sometimes I lead from behind, sometimes I lead from the side, and when necessary, from out the front, but always in relationship to the group. I've worked in arts and health, in community health centres, and I've worked in community cultural development and health promotion for over 30 years now. My journey has often felt very non-linear, unmapped, non-traditional. It's a learner's journey with no fixed destination. And I think the best way of my sharing some of my journey with you today is to tell you a couple of stories. They're stories that have really shaped the principles by which I work and how I show up as a leader. Okay, the first story is called The Rehearsal Room. And yes, those are penis puppets. I'm in the middle there with my penis puppet was old fella. And the hero penis on podium one was called Pippi. And I can't remember what the other penis was called, but my penis was the sort of dirty old man. And the hero penis Pippi was the sort of healthy, horny teenager, but very responsible. Before I start, though, I will just say there's a trigger warning with this story. It does talk about racism. So it's 1996, and Spice Girls Wannabe is #1 in the charts. I don't have a mobile phone, but I know a guy who does. We don't use email, and we write paper checks for big purchases. I've heard of the World Wide Web, but I've never used it. So this is a long time ago. I'm working in a theatre company that's been funded by a state government department to develop and deliver a health promotion project in the form of a touring theatre show. The show is about sexual health, contraception, and STIs. and is written by an Aboriginal playwright for Aboriginal young people and their communities. The cast is made up of 4 Aboriginal teenagers, 2 young men and 2 young women, an Aboriginal actor, Hank, who you can see here in the picture, and myself. So as soon as we got into the rehearsal process, and we had a long rehearsal process because the 4 teenagers had never done any performance before, the 2 young men in the cast told me that they were at war with people like me. And I still remember the shock and the sort of flustered feelings I had when they made that statement. But I was really stunned by their commitment to radical resistance to colonization as 16 and 18-year-olds in 1996. And I had that feeling of, you know, weren't we past this? I mean, hadn't things got better for Aboriginal people? And over time, they really shared the complexity of their daily lives, avoiding police, dealing with the constant threat of violence, of racism, of poverty. And until then, I was planning on pursuing a career in mainstream theatre, but that experience really sent me down a different path. So I realised in that rehearsal room that I knew nothing about the experience of young Aboriginal people, and I certainly knew nothing about how young people were actually engaged in radical resistance to colonisation. Something really shifted in my consciousness. And that was really the start of my understanding that there was so much about Australia that my whiteness hadn't let me know. And I realised that I would never have to bear the burden of race, and therefore these experiences were invisible to me. I guess it was really the start of something that South African scholar, Professor Melissa Stein, calls the uncomfortable knowledge. When you start to recognise your own complicity in systemic injustice by remaining ignorant of whiteness as a form of power. Now, I tell you this story because the shift was very significant in the way my journey plays out, but also because I think it was the first time I realised the power of the rehearsal room, or the power of creative practice, if you like. And really, this moment in the rehearsal room was a contact zone, what Professor Mary Louise Pratt describes. She uses the term contact zone to describe these social spaces where disparate cultures come together, meet, clash, grapple, and ultimately, sometimes, really come to understand something of each other's lives and come to understand something, come to understand new ways of knowing. So from there, I embarked on a career in community cultural development that focused on the arts to really unlock creative potential, to increase wellbeing, build the agency of communities to tell their own stories, and to find collective solutions for their own issues. About 4 years after the story that I just told you, I was running an arts and culture program for a very large community health centre on the North Richmond high-rise housing estate in inner Melbourne. So I spent the next 7 years really immersed in this vertical village of 4,000 people living in public housing. And it was here that I learned that leadership is relational. I learned how to collaborate across difference, and that was only possible by paying really close attention to the relationships with the members of the community living on the estate. I learned to listen in a really deep way, in a way that, you know, is focused on curiosity without judgment. And in his book, I think it's called Empathy, A Handbook for Revolution, Roman Kaczarek calls this radical listening, where you empty yourself of your own concerns and you listen with your whole being. And of course, so many Indigenous communities really practice that kind of deep listening as a central tenet of relationality. So I also learned that drawing on the capabilities and the knowledges within communities could really enable a collective sense of power and influence. It was the height of the early 2000s when I was working at North Richmond, and there was a heroin glut in Melbourne. There was only a few degrees of separation between the Vietnamese drug triads who were importing the heroin and the Richmond estate, which was a major centre for the distribution of heroin. It was a really, really fraught time for the people of North Richmond. They're just trying to bring up the kids, trying to pay their rent, make ends meet, practice culture, in what really felt like a war zone. There were drug deals going wrong everywhere. There were people overdosing daily, in public, and heavy policing. Many of the community felt really stigmatized, and that was largely due to the fact that the media had made out North Richmond high-rise housing estate to be public enemy number one. So these images on the screen are made with residents during that time, and they're based on the idea of the lotus as a symbol of human strength and beauty and dignity. So, out of the muddy water, the lotus grows. So it grows from mud, but it is always perfectly clean, and the lotus petals repel dust and dirt. So the installation on the left side of the screen is one that we made for the reclaiming of a set of old cricket nets that were used for drug trade, and the kids wanted them back to play. So that installation was right on the estate, and the other one is in a gallery, and the 400 white paper lotuses in the circle there we made on the estate, and we would just set up every day and have lots and lots of pieces of paper ready for people to fold, and people would just come in, fold some paper, have a cup of tea, and tell some stories. So Lotus Effect, as the series was called, was all about supporting that community to reframe their experience and to be able to tell their stories on their terms. So the North Richmond Arts and Culture program was a really important time for me in terms of my learning, but it was exceptionally important to the health and well-being of young people on that estate. It provided outlets for young people to be able to grapple with their own stories and, be seen and heard as complex beings was something really important to say. And they would do that through dance, rap, theatre, poetry, and visual art. It also supported a lot of cultural strengthening through festivals that were attended by thousands. And it built coalitions between groups of residents in order to advocate for resources and fight the stigma that everybody felt. So the managerial discourses of the day were very risk averse, and the management of the health centre was no different. And they didn't really, they thought having a very relational approach to leadership in the space that I was working was risky, and that, being too close to the community was something to be discouraged. So, the battles were many, and certainly, there were plenty of failures and some wins. But I think navigating that really restrictive environment, I learned a lot about the fact that if you embed values in everyday decisions, you can kind of live with, with some of the other restrictions. Leveraging influence through enabling community voice. Often I would be able to leverage more money, more time, more space when the community would speak up and ask for it. I learned very quickly how not to sweat the small stuff. because there's absolutely no point. You're going to be, you're going to be exhausted before you start. And I learned very, very quickly that I had to protect space for dialogue. And some of that dialogue was around having to explain the why I was making particular decisions. And sometimes that would take a whole lot longer than I would anticipate. I also needed to be really honest about the limitations of my power and influence. And that was something that I often learned the hard way, where I'd think I'd be able to get something across the line. So I'd be really positive about that, and then it wouldn't happen. So I learned very quickly, to manage expectations, and use my time and energy to push for the things that I knew I could get across the line. So I'm going to tell you another story to sort of demonstrate the practice of protecting and holding space. There's also a trigger warning with this story. It does mention a sexual assault, though the account is not about that particular incident. So we were rehearsing for a show for our annual Moon Lantern Festival that you can see on the screen here, when a young woman, I think she was about 16, fell to the ground when a group of actors huddled around her on stage. And this happened a couple of times. Every time a group of people would get around her, she would drop to the ground. And it would look like she'd fainted, but in actual fact, she was having a flashback and she was reliving a group sexual assault. So this was an extremely bewildering and traumatic experience for everyone in the room. I knew I couldn't risk her being triggered on the night of the performance. And I knew the stage was going to be too small, that she wasn't going to have people clustered around her. So I decided that I would ask her to withdraw from the performance. I spoke to her about that, and I put in a bunch of supports around her. And while she was really disappointed, she did understand the risks. The other young people were outraged, absolutely outraged. They were furious. How dare I take that away from her? And, there were threats of walking out on the show. Things got stolen from the office. There was multiple angry outbursts. It was a really, really tough time. So my co-worker Mary and I gathered the young people together. There was about 20 of them, and they were aged maybe 10 to 16. And we sat them down, and we sat in a circle on the ground for 2 hours, and we talked through what had happened. We talked through the effects of trauma on the body. We talked through how risky it was, both for the young woman's safety, but also for the people around her. And the festival was going to be jam-packed. There was going to be people everywhere. And we talked about the supports that we were putting in place to get this young woman some more help. And I could just see this group of young faces. They were so angry and so defiant and so frustrated when they came in. And I could just see them soften. And, they went from being so angry to being really quiet and really thoughtful. And they cried, I cried, Mary cried, we all cried, and we made peace. And look, they came to understand something really important about the impacts of trauma, but also about hard decision-making. That they were involved in that decision-making, even though I had made that decision, I'd made the call. They understood, and therefore it was okay. I left North Richmond after 7 years, and it was a really wrenching experience, but I stayed in touch with many of the young people who were part of the core group. And, some of them moved away, some died too young, but many went on to have their own families and build careers and do all sorts of things. And one young woman who's now, she'd be in her mid-30s, young Timorese woman, she's now running a childcare centre in the city, in Naarm in Melbourne. And my 17-year-old daughter is employed there 2 days a week while she does her Cert 3 in early childhood education. And this young woman said to my daughter recently, I'm your mum's legacy. Me and the other young people hanging around at that time, you know, we wouldn't have done what we do now if it hadn't been for the arts and culture program. And yeah, I was just deeply humbled by what she said, but it really just spoke to me about the power of the arts for both empowerment and for healing. So I took on a new role at a community health centre in Melbourne's western suburbs. It was called Barkly Arts Centre, and it was, a division of a very large. Well, it started off as a small health centre and then it merged, like most of them do, and it became Co-Health Arts Generator. And we were a generator. We were a really small engine room in a really, really large 30-site organisation. So we work to collaborate with local Aboriginal communities, lots and lots and lots of young people, largely from the African diaspora. It's a very high population of the African diaspora in the Western Melbourne. And we also worked with people in caravan parks and asylum seekers and school children. And we made and presented performances and exhibitions, installations, films, music in streets, in neighbourhood settings, in urban arts settings, and occasionally in mainstream settings like Melbourne Arts Centre. So equity was very, very central to our practice. And a lot of the work we did really challenged the sort of more bureaucratized models of participatory arts that is often delivered from dominant cultural standpoints. And our approach really, I guess, first and foremostly, it centered empowerment and cultural strengthening, but that was all done through recognizing and prioritizing lived experience as a critical form of knowledge. And the image you can see there on the screen is of a panel of young women speaking at an event that we ran a series of events called Movement Makers, where young people discussed their approaches to art making for social change. One of the ways that we tried to counter some of the inequities that so many of the young people we were working with experience was to mentor, train, and employ them as arts facilitators. And our workforce grew from this group, which was this was a very long-running project called Massive Hip Hop Choir, where young people came from all over the west of Melbourne as rappers, singers, dancers, spoken word artists to write and record and perform original music. And our workforce grew out of this particular group. So I guess our workforce by the time that I left, it had representative from the Tongan, Samoan, Ghanaian, Comoros Islands, South Sudanese, Lebanese, Ethiopian, Filipino, Ugandan. I think that's most of the diasporas that our workforce represented. So this meant that we had all of these embodied knowledges within our workforce that meant we could collaborate with multiple communities in a really deep and relational way on some really tough issues. One of the programs that we delivered during this time was Sisters and Brothers. And this was an anti-racism program for primary school children that drew on the lived experience of race-based discrimination and combined the lived experience of the arts facilitators with their arts practice in hip-hop. So all in hip-hop art forms. The aim of the piece was to increase racial literacy and build the skills and capabilities to be able to recognize racism in its various forms, call it out, call it in, and to be able to intervene. So this project won an Australian Human Rights Award in 2015. And it was a program that really promoted the development of leadership in young people from, historically less recognised communities in leadership spaces while they earned an income using their skills and knowledge. And I think the other thing that was so important about it was because we were in school, it was about the visibility of Black and brown educators to Black and brown kids. And largely, you know, our schools are still, our school teaching workforce is still predominantly Anglo or European. So that was a really important thing for these young people, seeing, for the children, seeing these young people as educators, as knowledge makers, as, you know, as people who had something important to say and share. It was also during the years of Sisters and Brothers that I started to collaborate with a group of researchers from Victoria University, which is based in the west of Melbourne. And I was working with a team of researchers led by Professor Chris Son. They were a team of community psychologist researchers. And they were really interested in how community arts practice can empower and enable healing from negative racialization. So I was super fortunate to have Chris and his team alongside us for years as they accompanied us as researchers through multiple really complex projects that positioned the young people as co-researchers. So it was during this time that I really learnt as a leader how to get out of the way, and make space for shared decision-making. I really learnt the value of having trusted, critical friends and welcoming their scrutiny of my practice and my approaches. And really, they really supported me too in understanding when it was that I made mistakes. And of course, I made plenty and I still do. But I think most importantly, they really supported the development of a theoretical language, both for myself and the young people that we were working with, to give us a way of being able to explain and understand what we were doing, outside of the academy. And I guess the other thing was this idea of, they introduced me to the idea of critical reflexivity. And Jessica Fernandez, who's a fantastic community psychology researcher in the States, describes critical reflexivity as a constant introspective evaluation of the self in relation to others, the social context, and the relations of power produced within and through social interactions. So what that means is, you know, becoming aware of the power dynamics in any given space that you're in, and understanding your own positionality within those dynamics. And once you understand that, then you've got a much better chance of understanding how things are going to land for others who have different lived experience from you. It also really helped me to develop a sense of my own accountability, and also to do the necessary repair work when I did make mistakes. And these were mistakes, you know, like many of us make, that were through good intention, but had negative consequences. And I think that's something that, a most important thing in leadership is to understand that things land differently for different people. And you have to be prepared for the fact that, you know, you're going to make some wicked mistakes through thinking that you're doing the right thing. So in both the settings of the stories that I told you earlier, I've witnessed, and in other roles, major contradictions between the intentions to bring resources, so time, people, money, projects, into communities to increase equity. But often the way the work is done serves to reinforce the inequities that were there in the first place. And I think that's largely because most institutions and organizations have white privilege so embedded that it is intangible and invisible to those doing the work. And I've just seen that time and time again in organizations that are, you know, that are there to help. That's their reason for being. I now work at Vic Health, which is the Health Promotion Foundation in Victoria, as the manager of health equity practice. And my role is to kind of address some of these contradictions. So I work across the organisation and with leadership to align the internal conditions and the practice, everyone's practice, with the change that we want to see in the communities that we serve. So part of it is focused on the culture of the organisation and ensuring that we practice the same equity and justice principles within the organisation and within the workplace. And the other part of the role is really equipping the practitioners and the health promotion staff to also embed those principles and practice in the work they're doing alongside communities. Vic Health is also very similar to what Kate was talking about, very focused on systems-based thinking, and all the research that I've ever seen anyway around systems thinking says that you can't possibly shift systems unless the conditions of the intervener align with the shift that you want to make. You just can't do it. So, you have to have those two things happening in concert with each other, which of course, is not easy. And I was just saying to the table that I was sitting with over there, who finds it the hardest to embed principles of equity and justice? Those people with the most power. And, it's all very well, and it's often the case that that senior leaders will go, oh, yes, no, we want to do that. We want to, we want to embed equity. We want to embed, principles of justice. But when it comes down to it, they have to change the most. So for the power to be redistributed, they have to turn inward and look at themselves and what they are prepared to relinquish. Otherwise, they're just going to perpetuate the status quo. So it's not easy work, but these days I really understand my purpose a lot better, I think. My purpose is to carve out space for young leaders from culturally and racially marginalised communities to come through, and I'll back them, I'll stand next to them, I'll stand behind them, because I don't actually think we're going to see any real change until our leadership is representative of the communities that we live within and alongside. So this is a photograph of the committee that I work with at Vic Health. These are all employees of Vic Health, and we are a committee who come together to examine the policies and the processes and the practices from an intersectional through an intersectional lens before we decide, what kinds of changes we're going to put forward to leadership and the board. So all of these are young people with very intersectional identities, culturally very diverse, with a range of different kinds of lived experience, and they are the brains trust of the health equity practice unit at Vic Health, because otherwise it would just be me. I'm going to finish here, but I'm just going to, and it was interesting that Kate also came back to care as central to any kind of leadership practice. It is essential to really recognise the emotional toll of leading progressively in restricted environments and restrictive systems. But it's possible. You choose your battles. Choosing your battles is critical. You find your allies, essential. You know your long-term purpose. That'll keep you going. And you have to practice care and rest and solidarity so that you are open and present for all the joy that comes with relational leadership. There's so much joy. And, God knows we need it in this particular historical moment. So yes, I really encourage everyone to embrace a relational form of leadership.
Thank you. Like I said, I felt like this whole day is me trying to share with you all the gifts that I myself have benefited from, and I don't think that I could have displayed it more clearly than with two such talks from yourself and from Kate. So thank you. I felt the gift in it.